Thunder cracked so loudly that Alina Whitmore dropped the candle she was carrying and it rolled under the bed, still burning. She had been trying to sleep for an hour, but the storm outside would not let her rest. Rain hit the windows like handfuls of gravel, and the wind screamed through the old trees behind the house. Then came a sound louder than the thunder. Someone was pounding on the front door. She froze. Her parents were away at her aunt's house in the next county and would not return until morning. The servants slept in the far wing, too far to hear anything over this storm. Alina was alone in a big, creaking house, and someone outside wanted in badly enough to keep hammering on the door even as the rain tried to drown out the sound. She grabbed a shawl from the chair, wrapped it around her shoulders over her nightgown, and hurried down the dark staircase. Her hair, usually pinned neatly, hung loose and tangled from tossing on her pillow. There was no time to fix it. Whoever was outside sounded desperate, and desperate people in a storm like this could be hurt, or worse, could be dangerous. She picked up the iron poker from beside the cold fireplace before reaching for the door handle. Better to be ready. She pulled the door open and the wind nearly tore it from her hand. Standing on the step was a tall man, soaked completely through, one arm pressed against his side. His dark coat, clearly expensive once, was ruined by mud and rain. His face was pale, and there was a cut above his eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face. Behind him, past the gate, she could see the shape of a carriage tipped on its side in the lane, one wheel still spinning slowly in the wind. "Please," he said, his voice rough. "My driver is hurt. I need help." Alina did not waste time asking questions. She lowered the poker and stepped back to let him through, then rushed past him into the storm, her bare feet slapping against the wet stone path. She found the driver, a heavy-set older man, pinned partly under the fallen carriage, groaning but conscious. Between the two of them, she and the stranger managed to pull him free. His leg was injured, not broken as far as she could tell, but he could not walk without support. They got him inside, into the small room off the kitchen where the estate kept spare cots for injured farmhands. Alina moved quickly, the way she always did in emergencies, fetching blankets, water, and the small box of medical supplies her mother kept for exactly this kind of night. She cleaned the driver's leg, wrapped it tightly, and gave him something warm to drink. Only when he was settled and breathing easier did she turn her attention to the man who had knocked on her door. He was sitting near the kitchen fire now, having refused a chair in the main room, saying he did not want to ruin good furniture with mud. He watched her work with an expression she could not quite read. Not pity, not amusement, something closer to surprise. "You are very calm for someone who just pulled a man out from under a carriage," he said. "There wasn't time to be anything else," Alina answered, not looking up from the driver's leg. "Panic doesn't fix broken bones." "No," he agreed slowly, "it doesn't." When she finally straightened up and looked at him properly, she noticed how out of place he seemed in her humble kitchen. Even soaked and bleeding, there was something about the way he sat, the quality of the ruined coat, the signet ring on his hand, that told her he was not an ordinary traveler. But she did not ask who he was. She simply reached for a clean cloth and a basin of water. "Let me see that cut," she said. "It's nothing. It's above your eye and it hasn't stopped bleeding. Sit still." He looked like he wanted to argue, then thought better of it. She cleaned the wound carefully, her fingers steady despite the late hour and the strangeness of the whole situation. Up close, she could see he was younger than she first thought, maybe 30, with sharp features and tired eyes that watched her every movement. "You didn't scream when you opened the door," he said suddenly. "Would that have helped?" "Most people would have." "Most people probably have servants awake at this hour," she said, dabbing gently at the cut. "I only have myself and a poker that, honestly, I wasn't sure I could actually use." For the first time since he had arrived, something like a smile touched his mouth. It faded quickly, but she had seen it. "What is your name?" he asked. "Alina Whitmore. This is my family's home." She finished bandaging his forehead and stepped back to look at her work. "And you still haven't told me yours." He hesitated just for a moment in a way that made her curious. "Nathaniel," he said. "Nathaniel Ashcombe." The name meant nothing to her at first, and something in his posture relaxed slightly when he saw that. Most people, she would later realize, reacted very differently to that name. But out here, in the countryside, far from London drawing rooms, Alina Whitmore had no idea she was bandaging the forehead of one of the most talked-about men in England. "Well, Mr. Ashcombe," she said, "your carriage is in no condition to go anywhere tonight, and neither is your driver. I'm afraid you're both stuck here until the storm passes and someone can fix that wheel." "I don't want to intrude." "You already have," she said, though not unkindly. "The intruding part is finished. Now we simply have to make the best of it." She showed him to one of the guest rooms upstairs, apologizing for the fact that it had not been aired out properly, that the fire would take a few minutes to catch, that there were no fresh clothes his size anywhere in the house. He told her more than once that she did not need to apologize for anything, that she had likely saved his driver's leg and possibly more. Only when she returned to her own room, finally alone, did Alina catch her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. Her hair was a wild mess, damp curls sticking out in every direction. Her nightgown was rain-spotted and clinging to her arms. She looked nothing like the composed young woman who greeted guests at her mother's dinner parties. She looked, she thought with a tired laugh, like exactly what she was. Someone who had just spent the last hour in a storm pulling an injured man out from under a broken carriage. She had no idea, as she finally lay down to sleep with the storm still rumbling outside, that the man sleeping in her guest room would think about her wild hair and her steady hands for a very long time afterward. She did not know that most women who met Nathaniel Ashcombe spent hours preparing themselves before he ever saw them, arranging every curl, choosing every word. She had simply opened a door and done what needed to be done. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside washed clean and dripping. Alina woke early, as she always did, and went down to check on their unexpected guests before the household staff returned from their own quarters. She found Nathaniel already awake, standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the wet fields. He had changed into dry clothes borrowed from her father's wardrobe, though they did not fit him well, the sleeves too short, the shoulders too tight. "You look ridiculous," she said before she could stop herself. He glanced down at himself and, to her surprise, laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and a little rusty, as though he had not used it in some time. "I imagine I do," he said, "though I suspect I looked no better bleeding on your doorstep." "No," she admitted, "you didn't." He turned to study her properly in the morning light, and something in his gaze made her suddenly aware of her own appearance again, her hair only loosely tied back now, her plain morning dress. But instead of looking away or making some polite comment, he simply looked at her the way one looks at something unexpectedly interesting. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for last night. I don't think you understand what you did. I helped a man with a broken carriage. It's not so unusual out here." "It is more unusual than you know," he said, and there was something in his voice, some weight behind the words, that made her wonder again exactly who this stranger really was. But before she could ask, the sound of hooves on gravel came from outside. A messenger had arrived, sent, it turned out, from a nearby inn where word had already spread that a nobleman's carriage had gone off the road during the storm. Alina watched as the messenger's eyes went wide the moment he saw Nathaniel standing in her kitchen. He bowed so low his hat nearly touched the floor. "Your Grace," the young man said, "we feared the worst when the carriage was found." Alina's hands went still on the teapot she had been holding. "Your Grace." She turned slowly to look at the man she had bandaged the night before, the man wearing her father's ill-fitting shirt, and understood all at once exactly who had knocked on her door in the middle of the storm. He was not simply a traveler, he was a duke. And she had answered the door to him in her nightgown, with her hair a wild mess and a fireplace poker in her hand. The messenger did not stay long. He delivered his message, confirmed that a proper carriage would be sent within the hour, and rode off again, clearly relieved to have found his employer alive and only lightly injured. Alina stood in her kitchen holding a teapot she had forgotten she was still gripping, staring at the man who had just been addressed as Your Grace. "You could have told me," she said finally. "Would it have changed anything you did last night?" Nathaniel asked. She thought about it honestly before answering. "No, I would have pulled your driver out from under that carriage either way. I might have been more nervous handing you a basin of water, though." "That's exactly why I didn't tell you," he said. "I wanted to see what someone would do when they had no idea who I was." There was something almost vulnerable in the way he said it, as though this small test mattered to him more than he wanted to admit. Alina set the teapot down and studied him for a long moment. In the daylight, without the blood and the rain, he looked younger, less like the stern portraits of noblemen she had seen in newspapers, and more like an ordinary man who had simply had a very bad night. "Well," she said at last, "now you know. I would have done the same for a farmer or a duke. It makes no difference to me." "That," he said quietly, "is precisely why it makes such a difference to me." Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of the household staff arriving pulled her attention away, and the strange, private moment between them dissolved into the ordinary business of the morning. Alina busied herself explaining to the cook why there was a duke sitting at their kitchen table in her father's shirt, while Nathaniel insisted, more than once, that he did not require any special treatment. His new carriage did not arrive as quickly as the messenger had promised. A wheel had to be brought from the next town, and then a storm-damaged bridge delayed the wagon carrying it by a full day. By the time everything was sorted, 2 more days had passed, and Nathaniel Ashcombe, Duke of Carrington, found himself an unplanned guest in the modest but comfortable home of the Whitmore family. Alina's parents returned on the second day, and her mother nearly fainted at the news that a duke had been staying under their roof. Mrs. Whitmore threw herself into a frenzy of preparation, insisting on proper meals, proper linens, and proper conversation topics, terrified that her daughter had somehow embarrassed the family in her absence. Alina tried to explain that Nathaniel seemed to prefer things exactly as they had been before her parents arrived, simple and unfussy, but her mother would not be convinced. At dinner that evening, Mrs. Whitmore chattered nervously about the weather, the roads, and the honor of hosting such a distinguished guest, while Alina's father asked careful questions about London society that he clearly hoped would make him sound informed. Nathaniel answered politely, but without much enthusiasm, and Alina noticed how his eyes kept drifting toward her, as if he found the performance around the table far less interesting than whatever she happened to be doing. After dinner, when her parents retired early, tired from their journey, Alina found herself alone with Nathaniel in the small library at the back of the house. She had gone in to fetch a book and had not expected him to follow. "Your parents are very kind," he said, settling into the chair by the window without waiting for an invitation. "My mother is terrified she'll say the wrong thing and ruin everything," Alina said, pulling a book from the shelf. "My father wants you to think he reads the London papers every single day, when really he only skims the headlines." Nathaniel laughed, that same unguarded laugh from the morning before. "I find that far more charming than half the conversations I have in the city." "You must have very boring conversations in the city." "You have no idea," he said, and something tired crept into his voice. "Everyone wants something from you when you carry a title, a connection, an introduction, a marriage. Nobody simply talks to you anymore. They talk to the Duke." Alina sat down across from him, the book forgotten in her lap. "That sounds lonely." He looked at her, surprised, as though no one had said that particular word to him before. "It is," he admitted. "Lonelier than most people would believe possible for someone who is never actually alone." They talked for a long while that evening, longer than either of them probably intended. He asked about her life at the estate, about the accounts she helped manage since her father's health had begun to decline, about the calluses on her hands that came from tending the garden herself rather than leaving it entirely to the gardener. She asked about his childhood, about the father he had lost young, about the responsibilities that had landed on his shoulders before he was truly ready for them. Neither of them performed for the other. There was no flattery, no careful arrangement of words meant to impress. Alina spoke plainly, the way she always did, and Nathaniel found himself doing the same, dropping the careful, guarded manner he wore like armor in London. The next morning, Alina discovered him in the garden before breakfast, examining the roses she had planted along the south wall. He did not hear her approach at first, and she paused to watch him, struck by how different he looked out here, sleeves rolled up, hands in his pockets, no audience to perform for. "You garden yourself," he said without turning around, somehow sensing her presence. "I noticed the dirt under your fingernails the first night when you were bandaging my head. Is that a polite way of telling me I have dirty hands?" "It's a polite way of telling me you're not like anyone I usually meet," he said, finally turning to face her. "Most young women I know would never let their hands look anything but perfect." "Then most young women you know have never grown their own tomatoes," Alina said, walking past him to check on a struggling rose bush. "There's nothing wrong with a little dirt, Your Grace." "Nathaniel," he corrected gently. "Please, just Nathaniel when it's only the two of us." She glanced at him, weighing the strange intimacy of the request, then nodded slowly. "Nathaniel." Something shifted between them in that moment, small but unmistakable, like a door quietly opening that had been shut for a long time. They spent the rest of the morning walking the grounds together, Alina pointing out which plants she had grown from seed, which trees her grandfather had planted decades before, which fields would need attention before the coming winter. Nathaniel listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was truly paying attention, not simply waiting for his turn to speak. By the third day, it had become an unspoken habit. Every morning before the household fully woke, Alina would find Nathaniel already outside, and they would walk together, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about the pressure of managing his estates, the endless letters demanding decisions, the exhausting expectation that he marry soon and produce an heir. She told him about her fears for her family's finances, the slow decline of their fortune, the quiet dread of what might happen if her father's health did not improve. "Do you ever want to simply walk away from all of it?" she asked him one morning, as they stood by the old stone bridge at the edge of the property, watching the stream rush by, still swollen from the storm. "Every day," he admitted, "but walking away means leaving people who depend on me. Tenants, servants, family. It isn't only my life to arrange." "That's a heavy thing to carry." "It is," he said, looking at her rather than the stream. "Though these past few days it has felt lighter than it has in years." Alina felt her cheeks warm and looked away, pretending sudden interest in a bird landing on the bridge railing. She was aware, in a way she had not quite allowed herself to admit, that something was changing between them, something that had nothing to do with dukes or estates or storms, and everything to do with the way her heart seemed to beat a little faster whenever he was near. That evening, the repaired carriage finally arrived, along with word that Nathaniel's driver, having recovered enough to travel, was ready to leave the following morning. The news should have brought relief. Instead, Alina found herself unexpectedly troubled by it, and when she caught Nathaniel's eye across the dinner table that night, she saw the same troubled look reflected back at her. After dinner, he found her in the garden again, this time under the pale light of the moon rather than the morning sun. "I leave tomorrow," he said simply. "I know." "Alina," he began, and then stopped, as though uncertain how to continue. She waited, her heart beating strangely fast, watching him search for words that clearly did not come easily to him. "These past days have been unlike any I've had in a very long time. I don't quite know how to explain what that means." "You don't have to explain," she said quietly. "I understand." "Do you?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because I'm not entirely sure I understand it myself." For a moment, standing there in the moonlit garden, it felt as though something might happen between them, some word or gesture that would change everything. But then the sound of footsteps on the gravel path broke the moment, and Aliner's mother appeared, calling that it was growing late and the night air was not good for anyone's health. Nathaniel stepped back, the careful, guarded expression returning to his face like a mask sliding into place. "Good night, Aliner," he said, and there was something final in the way he said it, something that made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. She did not sleep well that night, turning the conversation over and over in her mind, wondering what he had been about to say before her mother's interruption. When morning came, she dressed carefully, more carefully than she had in years, and went down to say goodbye, half expecting, half hoping, that whatever had almost happened in the garden might find its way into words in the daylight. But Nathaniel was already composed, already every inch the Duke again, thanking her parents formally for their hospitality, pressing a generous sum into her father's hand to cover the trouble of the past days, despite her father's protests. When he turned to Aliner, his expression was polite, careful, the warmth she had glimpsed over the past few days tucked carefully out of sight. "Miss Whitmore," he said formally, bowing slightly, "thank you for everything." "Your Grace," she replied, matching his formality, though it felt like swallowing something sharp to do it. He climbed into his carriage without looking back, and Aliner stood at the gate long after the sound of wheels on gravel had faded into silence, wondering if the past few days had simply been a strange, brief interruption in both their ordinary lives, or if they had been the beginning of something neither of them yet knew how to name. Weeks passed, and life at the Whitmore estate slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Aliner rose early, tended the garden, checked the accounts with her father, and helped her mother manage the small household. On the surface, nothing had changed, but something inside her felt different, restless in a way she could not quite name. She caught herself glancing toward the road more often than she used to, half-hopping to see a carriage approaching, though she told herself firmly that such hopes were foolish. She had heard nothing from Nathaniel since he left. Not a letter, not a message, nothing. She told herself this was to be expected. Dukes did not write to country girls they had spent a few strange, storm-bound days with. Whatever had almost happened in that moonlit garden had likely meant far less to him than it had come to mean to her, turned over so many times in her mind that it had grown into something larger than it probably deserved. Her mother, meanwhile, had other plans for her future entirely. A family friend, Mr. Harlan Gray, had recently inherited a comfortable property 2 counties over, and Mrs. Whitmore had decided, with the enthusiasm of someone determined to secure her daughter's future, that he would make a fine match for Aliner. Harlan was pleasant enough, if a little dull, with a habit of discussing crop yields at every possible opportunity. He began visiting more frequently, always with a small gift, always with careful, practiced compliments that Aliner found oddly hollow after her conversations with Nathaniel. He would provide security, her mother said one evening, after Harlan had left following another long dinner filled with talk of wheat prices. "Your father's health is not improving, Aliner. We must think practically." "I know," Aliner said, and she did know. She understood the weight of responsibility resting on her shoulders, the quiet dread that had settled over the household since her father's doctor had begun speaking in careful, worried tones. A marriage to Harlan Gray would solve many problems. It would simply not solve the strange ache that had settled in her chest since a certain carriage had disappeared down the road weeks ago. Meanwhile in London, Nathaniel Ashcombe was fighting battles of his own, though of a very different kind. His return to society had been met with immediate scrutiny. Word had somehow spread, as it always did in circles where gossip moved faster than official news, that the Duke of Carrington had spent several days stranded at the home of an unmarried young woman during a storm. The story grew with each retelling, twisting from a simple accident into something far more scandalous, until half of London seemed to believe that Nathaniel had been secretly courting some mysterious country beauty behind closed doors. His aunt, Lady Beatrice, who had managed his household affairs since his mother's passing, was beside herself with concern. "You must address this immediately," she told him one afternoon, packing his study with a stack of gossip papers in her hand. "The Ashcombe name cannot survive this kind of speculation unanswered. People are already asking who this girl is, whether you have compromised her, whether there is an understanding between you." "There is nothing to address," Nathaniel said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Nothing improper happened." "That will not matter to society," Lady Beatrice said sharply. "What matters is what people believe happened. And right now, they believe you have made some unsuitable attachment to a girl with no fortune and no connections. You must be seen at events. You must be seen with appropriate company. Otherwise, this scandal will follow you for years." Nathaniel knew, with a heaviness that settled deep in his chest, that his aunt was right. The rules of his world were rarely fair, but they were unyielding. So he allowed himself to be steered back into the social calendar he had grown to despise, attending balls and dinners he had no interest in, standing through hours of polite conversation that felt emptier than ever after the honest, easy conversations he had shared with Alina. It was at one such ball that he first encountered Lady Cordelia Ashworth, a woman whose ambition matched her considerable beauty. Cordelia had heard the rumors about the country incident, and rather than being deterred, she saw opportunity. If the Duke's reputation needed rehabilitation, she reasoned, what better way than to be seen prominently at his side, erasing any talk of unsuitable country attachments with her own impeccable pedigree. She approached him with practiced charm, laughing at his jokes before he had finished making them, agreeing with his opinions before he had fully voiced them, performing exactly the kind of polished, effortless perfection that London society expected. Nathaniel found himself comparing her, almost against his will, to Alina, who had never once tried to flatter him, who had told him bluntly when she disagreed with something he said, who had looked at him with dirt still under her fingernails and never once seemed impressed by his title. "You seem distracted, Your Grace," Cordelia said, snapping her fan closed with a delicate click. "Forgive me," Nathaniel replied. "I have a great deal on my mind." Perhaps a dance would help clear it. He danced with her because refusing would have caused more talk than he could afford, but his mind kept drifting to a garden bathed in moonlight, to a voice that never performed, to hands that knew how to bandage a wound as easily as they tended roses. The rumors, rather than fatting, grew worse over the following weeks. Someone, perhaps a servant with loose lips or a jealous rival eager to cause trouble, had discovered Alina's name and shared it in the wrong circles. Soon whispers of Alina Whitmore reached even the country neighborhoods surrounding her family's estate, twisted and exaggerated, until the story bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. Some said she had thrown herself at the Duke during the storm, using the accident as an excuse to trap him. Others said far worse things. Cruel and unfounded, the kind of talk that could ruin a young woman's prospects entirely. Alina first heard the rumors from a neighbor's daughter, who delivered the news with poorly disguised delight, watching Alina's face carefully for a reaction. Alina kept her expression steady, refusing to give the girl the satisfaction of seeing her upset. But that night, alone in her room, she finally allowed herself to cry, overwhelmed by the unfairness of being punished for simply helping an injured stranger during a storm. Her mother was horrified when the rumors reached her ears as well, terrified that Alina's reputation, and by extension the family's standing, would be permanently damaged. "This is exactly why we must secure your match with Mr. Gray quickly," she insisted. "Before this nonsense grows any worse, a respectable engagement will silence the gossip." Alina wanted to protest, wanted to say that marrying Harlan Gray to escape a scandal she had not caused felt like its own kind of injustice, but she also understood her mother's fear was not unreasonable. Reputation, in their world, was a fragile and precious thing, easily shattered and nearly impossible to fully repair once broken. She threw herself into practical matters instead, helping her father review the estate's dwindling finances late into the evenings, trying not to think about moonlit gardens or conversations that had felt more honest than any others in her life. But some nights, despite her best efforts, she found herself standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the road, remembering the sound of a carriage arriving during a storm, and wondering with a mixture of hope and hurt whether Nathaniel ever thought of her at all. He did, though she had no way of knowing it. In London, Nathaniel spent his days fulfilling obligations and his nights lying awake, turning over the same question again and again. He thought of Alina constantly, in the middle of tedious meetings with his estate managers, during Lady Cordelia's carefully rehearsed laughter, in the quiet moments before sleep finally came. He found himself comparing every woman he met to a girl in a rain-damp nightgown who had once looked at him with nothing but practical concern in her eyes. No calculation, no performance, simply the honest instinct to help someone in need. Lady Beatrice, noticing his continued distraction, grew increasingly insistent that he formalize some understanding with Cordelia, arguing that a public engagement would finally silence the lingering gossip about the country incident once and for all. She would make a fine duchess, his aunt pressed one evening. Beautiful, well-connected, entirely suitable. What more could you want? Someone who speaks to me honestly, Nathaniel said quietly, rather than someone who has calculated exactly what I want to hear before I've finished asking for it. His aunt sighed, exasperated. Honesty is a fine quality in a friend, Nathaniel. It is not the primary requirement for a duchess. But Nathaniel could not shake the feeling that his aunt was wrong, that something essential was missing from every polished, perfect conversation he had with Cordelia and women like her. Something he had found, briefly and unexpectedly, in a modest country house during a storm. The tension reached its breaking point one evening when Cordelia, growing impatient with what she perceived as unnecessary delay, cornered him during a private moment at yet another society gathering. "Everyone expects an announcement soon, Your Grace," she said, her voice sweet but her eyes sharp. "It would be a shame to disappoint them, and a greater shame to let foolish rumors about some country nobody continue to follow you." Something in the dismissive way she spoke of Alina, reducing her to a nobody, a foolish rumor, struck Nathaniel harder than he expected. He realized, standing there in the middle of a crowded ballroom, surrounded by exactly the kind of glittering, empty performance he had grown to resent, that he could not continue pretending any longer. "Lady Cordelia," he said carefully, "I think you have misunderstood my intentions. I have made no promises to you, and I do not intend to." Her carefully composed expression flickered, just for a moment, revealing something colder underneath the charm. "I see," she said, her voice tight. "And this refusal, I assume, has something to do with your country nobody." "Her name," Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the anger rising in his chest, "is Alina Whitmore, and you would do well not to speak of her that way again." He left the ballroom that night with his reputation likely more damaged than ever, having publicly rejected the woman his aunt and half of society had expected him to marry. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something close to relief, as though he had finally stopped performing a role that had never truly fit him. Back at the country estate, Alina's own situation was reaching a crisis point of its own. Her father's health had worsened, the doctor's visits growing more frequent and more grave, and the family's finances had grown increasingly precarious. Harlan Gray, sensing the family's desperation, had grown bolder in his attentions, and one evening, after another long dinner filled with talk of crops and prices, he asked to speak with Alina's father privately. Alina sat in the parlor afterward, her mother beaming with relief beside her, and understood, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, exactly what had been discussed. A proposal was coming, likely within days, and given the family's circumstances, refusing it would be a luxury she was not sure she could afford. That night she stood once again at her window, looking out at the dark road, thinking of moonlit gardens and honest conversations, and a man who had once told her that these past days had been unlike any he'd had in a very long time. She wondered, with a quiet ache that had settled permanently in her chest, whether those words had meant anything at all, or whether she had simply imagined a connection that existed only in her own hopeful heart. Harlan Gray's formal proposal arrived 3 days later, delivered in the same dull, practical tone he used to discuss crop yields. He spoke of a comfortable household, of shared responsibilities, of the sensible advantages such a union would bring to both families. Alina listened, sitting stiffly in the parlor with her parents hovering nearby, and felt nothing resembling the warmth she had once felt standing beside a stone bridge with a man who had asked if she ever wanted to walk away from everything. She did not answer immediately. She asked for a few days to consider, and though Harlan seemed mildly surprised, he agreed, no doubt confident that practical circumstances would eventually make her decision for her. Alina spent those days in a fog, moving through her usual routines, tending the garden, checking accounts, sitting with her increasingly frail father, all while a quiet voice in the back of her mind kept asking whether she was about to trade away any chance at real happiness simply because it seemed the responsible thing to do. Meanwhile, in London, Nathaniel's rejection of Lady Cordelia had sent exactly the kind of shockwaves through society that his aunt had feared. The gossip papers, rather than moving on from the country incident, seized upon this new development with even greater enthusiasm, speculating wildly about the mysterious country woman who had apparently captured the Duke's attention so thoroughly that he would publicly humiliate one of society's most eligible women rather than pursue her. Lady Beatrice was furious, though beneath her frustration lay a genuine concern for her nephew's well-being that Nathaniel had perhaps underestimated. She confronted him in his study, closing the door firmly behind her before speaking. "Do you understand what you have done?" she demanded. "You have made an enemy of a woman with considerable influence, and for what? A girl you spent a handful of days with months ago." "It was not a handful of days that changed anything, Aunt Beatrice," Nathaniel said quietly. "It was the fact that for those few days I felt like myself for the first time in years. Everything since has felt like performing a part I never auditioned for." His aunt's expression softened slightly, though her worry remained. "I understand more than you think I do, Nathaniel. I married for duty myself many years ago, and I have watched you carry burdens no young man should have to carry alone since your father passed. But you cannot simply abandon your responsibilities because of a feeling, however genuine it might be." "I am not asking to abandon anything," Nathaniel said. "I am asking to be allowed to choose who shares those responsibilities with me." Lady Beatrice studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. As though she were seeing him clearly for the first time in a long while, not as the Duke burdened with obligations, but as the young man who had lost his father too early and had never quite been allowed to simply be himself. "This girl," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "Tell me about her properly, not the gossip, the truth." So Nathaniel told her everything: the storm, the injured driver, the poker Alina had been prepared to use to defend herself, the morning spent walking the grounds, the honest conversations that had felt like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocating formality. He told her about Alina's calloused hands and her sharp wit, and the way she had never once, in all their conversations, tried to impress him or flatter him or ask for anything at all. By the time he finished, Lady Beatrice's expression had changed entirely. "Well," she said, a faint smile finally breaking through her earlier frustration, "that does sound rather different from what the papers have been suggesting." "It is entirely different," Nathaniel said. "And I fear I have already wasted too much time worrying about what society expects instead of simply going to her and telling her the truth." "Then perhaps," his aunt said, "you should stop wasting more of it." But before Nathaniel could act on his aunt's unexpected blessing, a letter arrived that changed the shape of everything. It came from an old family friend who maintained connections throughout the countryside, mentioning, almost as an afterthought amid other local news, that the Whitmore family of the neighboring county was soon to announce an engagement between their daughter Eleanor and a Mr. Harlan Gray, a match that would apparently secure the family's finances during a difficult period. Nathaniel read the letter twice, then a third time, a cold weight settling in his chest with each reading. He had waited too long, caught up in the tangled expectations of his own world, while Eleanor's world had continued moving forward without him, carrying her toward a future that did not include him at all. He almost let despair take hold, almost convinced himself that he had missed his chance entirely, and that showing up now would only cause her more difficulty, more scandal, more complication in a life already burdened by her family's struggles. But then he thought of her steady hands cleaning his wound that first night, her blunt honesty about her own fears for her family's future, the way she had asked him if he ever wanted to walk away from everything, as though she understood exactly what it meant to feel trapped by circumstances beyond your control. He could not simply let her disappear into a practical, loveless arrangement without at least telling her the truth of his own feelings. Whatever happened afterward, whatever choice she made, she deserved to make it with full knowledge of how he felt, rather than believing, as she likely did, that he had simply forgotten her the moment his carriage disappeared down the road. "I need to go to her," he told Lady Beatrice that same evening, already calling for his carriage to be prepared, "before it's too late." "Nathaniel," his aunt said carefully, "if this match has already been arranged, your arrival could cause considerable scandal for the family. You must consider what is best for her, not only what you want for yourself." "I have considered it," he said, "and I believe what is best for her is knowing the truth before she commits herself to a life without it. After that, the choice will be entirely hers to make." Lady Beatrice studied her nephew for a long moment, seeing in his determined expression something she had not seen in years, not since before his father's death had forced him into responsibilities far too heavy for a young man barely out of boyhood. Whatever reservations she still carried about scandal and society's expectations, she found she could not bring herself to stand in the way of whatever this was. "Then go," she said simply. "And Nathaniel, whatever happens, I am glad to see you fighting for something you actually want, rather than simply accepting whatever is handed to you." The journey to the Whitmore estate felt endless, though it took only slightly longer than his previous unplanned visit had, storm and broken carriage aside. Nathaniel spent the hours turning over what he might say, how he might explain the strange tangle of duty and desire that had kept him from writing sooner, from returning sooner, from simply following his own instincts the moment he had left her standing at that gate months ago. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore estate, Eleanor had finally reached her own decision. She had spent days weighing practicality against the persistent ache in her chest that refused to fade no matter how firmly she told herself it should. In the end, watching her father's increasingly weary face, understanding the very real financial pressures bearing down on her family, she had resolved to accept Harlan Gray's proposal. It was, she told herself repeatedly, the sensible choice, the responsible choice, the choice any reasonable person in her position would make. She had asked Harlan to call the following afternoon so she could give him her answer formally. The morning of that appointed day, she dressed carefully, forcing herself not to think about moonlit gardens or honest conversations, focusing instead on the practical relief her answer would bring to her worried parents. She was in the garden, cutting flowers for the parlor where she would soon receive Harlan's visit, when she heard the unmistakable sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. She assumed, at first, that Harlan had simply arrived early, and she straightened her dress, preparing to greet him with whatever composure she could manage. But when she turned toward the drive, the carriage that came into view was not Harlan Gray's modest, practical vehicle. It was a much finer carriage, one she recognized instantly, having watched it disappear down this very road months before with an ache in her chest she had never fully managed to shake. Her hands, still holding the flowers she had been cutting, began to tremble slightly as the carriage came to a stop and the door opened. Nathaniel stepped down, dressed simply, without the careful formality he usually wore in public, his expression a mixture of determination and something rower, something that looked almost like fear. "Eleanor," he said, crossing the distance between them quickly, as though he could not bear another moment of separation now that he had finally arrived. "I know I have no right to appear here unannounced, especially now, especially with everything I've heard about your engagement, but I could not let you make this choice without knowing the truth first." "Nathaniel," she managed, her voice barely steady, the flowers nearly slipping from her grasp. "What are you doing here?" "I should have come sooner," he said, and the words tumbled out of him now, all the careful composure he usually maintained falling away entirely. "I should have written, should have followed my own heart instead of allowing duty and expectation to keep me tangled in London for months while you were here, believing I had forgotten you. I have not forgotten you, Eleanor, not for a single day." Eleanor stood frozen in the garden, flowers still clutched in her trembling hands, staring at the man who had just crossed an entire county to reach her. Every practical thought she had carefully constructed over the past weeks, every argument for why Harlan Gray represented the sensible choice, every reason she had given herself for accepting a comfortable, loveless arrangement, seemed to scatter like leaves in a sudden wind. "You cannot simply appear like this," she said, though her voice lacked any real conviction behind the protest. "Nathaniel, I have an engagement to consider. My family's future depends on decisions I am supposed to make today." "I know," he said, closing the remaining distance between them until he stood only a few steps away. "I know about the finances, about your father's health, about everything you have been carrying on your shoulders while I remain tangled up in London society, foolishly believing that duty required me to stay silent about my feelings. I was wrong, Eleanor. I have been wrong for months, and I refuse to remain wrong for a single day longer." "What exactly are you saying?" she asked, though some part of her already understood, had perhaps understood from the moment she recognized his carriage on the drive. "I am saying," Nathaniel replied, "that I have spent every day since I left this house thinking of you, not the Duke's obligations, not society's expectations, not the endless performance of a role I never wanted. You, your steadiness during a crisis, your refusal to be impressed by titles. The way you spoke to me as though I were simply a person and not a position to be managed or flattered. I have never felt more like myself than I did during those few days here, and I have been miserable every single day since, pretending that returning to my old life could ever feel the same again." Eleanor felt tears gathering, though whether from relief or lingering fear or simple overwhelming emotion, she could not entirely say. "There were rumors, Nathaniel, terrible things said about me because of those days. My reputation suffered. My family suffered. And you never wrote, never sent word, never gave any indication that any of it mattered to you at all." Something in his expression crumpled slightly at that, guilt clearly weighing on him. "I know, and I am deeply sorry for that silence. I allowed my aunt my obligations, my own fear of causing you further difficulty, to convince me that staying away was somehow the responsible choice. I was wrong. I should have come the moment I heard the rumors had reached you, should have defended your name publicly rather than allowing gossip to spread unchecked while I remained silent in London. I have already begun correcting that mistake, but I understand if it comes too late to matter." Eleanor set the flowers down carefully on the garden bench beside her, needing her hands free, needing a moment to gather thoughts that felt scattered and overwhelmed all at once. "Harlan is coming this afternoon. I intended to accept his proposal." "And do you want to accept it?" Nathaniel asked, his voice quiet now, careful, as though he understood this question mattered more than anything else he might say. "Not because it is practical, not because your family needs security, but because it is genuinely what you want." She was quiet for a long moment, searching for an honest answer amid the tangle of practical obligation and quiet longing that had defined the past several weeks of her life. "No," she finally admitted, the word barely more than a whisper. "I do not want to marry Harlan Gray. I have been trying to convince myself that wanting something else entirely was foolish, was impractical, was a fantasy I had built around a handful of storm-bound days that likely meant far less to you than they came to mean to me." "They meant everything to me," Nathaniel said immediately. "Eleanor, I did not come here today as the Duke of Carrington asking for a practical arrangement that would benefit both our families. I came here as Nathaniel, the man you bandaged and fed and walked with through gardens at dawn, asking whether you might consider building a life with me, not because of what I can offer your family financially, though I would gladly help however I am able, but because I cannot imagine continuing my own life without you in it. Your family, your society, they will never accept this," Eleanor said, though the protest sounded weaker even to her own ears. "A duke marrying a country girl with no fortune and a family whose finances are, frankly, a mess. There will be more scandal, more talk." "Let them talk," Nathaniel said firmly. "I have spent my entire adult life carefully managing what society thinks of me, performing exactly the role expected of a duke, and I have never once felt as genuinely happy as I did during those few days in this garden with you. My aunt, who I feared would object most strongly, has already given her blessing. Whatever scandal follows, I would rather face it beside you than spend another empty year pretending contentment with a life that leaves me feeling entirely alone." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of another carriage approaching drew both their attention. Harlan Gray's modest carriage pulled up the drive, exactly on schedule for the appointment Eleanor had arranged. She felt a moment of panic, uncertain how to navigate this collision of two entirely different futures arriving at her door within moments of each other. "Eleanor," Nathaniel said quietly, sensing her hesitation, "whatever you decide, I will respect your choice. I am not here to force anything upon you, only to make certain you know the full truth before you commit yourself to a different path. If you still believe Mr. Gray represents the life you truly want, I will leave and trouble you no further." Eleanor looked between the approaching carriage and the man standing before her, dressed simply, having crossed an entire county without regard for his own reputation, choosing honesty over the careful performance his position usually demanded. She thought of Harlan's dull recitations about crop yields, of the comfortable but passionless future he offered, and then she thought of moonlit gardens and honest conversations, and a man who had asked whether she ever wanted to walk away from everything expected of her. Harlan Gray stepped down from his carriage, immediately noticing the unfamiliar, considerably finer vehicle already parked in the drive, his expression shifting to confusion, and then something more guarded as he approached. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, glancing between Eleanor and Nathaniel, "I did not realize you had another guest." Eleanor took a steadying breath, understanding that whatever she said next would determine the entire shape of her future. "Mr. Gray," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word, "I owe you an honest answer, and I am afraid it is not the one you were hoping for. I cannot accept your proposal. It would not be fair to either of us for me to marry you while my heart belongs elsewhere." Harlan's expression flickered through several emotions, surprise, mild embarrassment, and finally something like grudging understanding, as his eyes moved to Nathaniel and seemed to piece together the situation before him. "I see," he said, with more dignity than Eleanor had expected. "Well, I cannot say I am not disappointed, but I would rather you be honest now than regret a hasty decision later. I wish you happiness, Miss Whitmore, whatever path you choose." He offered a polite bow, climbed back into his carriage, and departed without further complaint, leaving Eleanor and Nathaniel alone in the garden once more, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the flower beds. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Nathaniel said, though his eyes were bright with something like hope. "Perhaps it was both," Eleanor admitted, allowing herself a small laugh despite the enormity of what had just happened. "But it was honest, and I find I am tired of pretending otherwise about what I actually want." Nathaniel closed the remaining distance between them, taking her hands gently in his own. "And what is it you actually want, Eleanor Whitmore?" She looked up at him, this man who had appeared out of a storm and somehow rearranged everything she thought she understood about her own future, and found the answer came easily, without hesitation. "You," she said simply. "Not the Duke, not the title, not the estates or the responsibilities that come with them. Simply you, exactly as you were during those storm-bound days when neither of us pretended to be anything other than ourselves." "Then marry me," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "Not because it would be practical, not because it would solve either of our family's difficulties, though I hope it might help in that regard as well, but because I love you, Eleanor, entirely and without reservation, and I cannot imagine building any future that does not include you at the center of it." Tears finally spilled freely down Eleanor's cheeks, though she was smiling now, the practical worry and quiet longing of the past weeks finally resolving into something clear and certain. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you, Nathaniel Ashcombe." He pulled her close, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply standing together in the garden where their strange, unlikely connection had first taken root during quiet morning walks months before. Word of their engagement spread quickly, and just as Lady Beatrice had predicted, there was talk, plenty of it, throughout London society. But Nathaniel found he genuinely did not care what was said, standing firmly beside Eleanor through every awkward introduction, every raised eyebrow from society matrons who had hoped for a grander match, every whispered comment about country girls and dukes who married beneath their station. Eleanor, for her part, faced the scrutiny with the same steady composure she had shown that first stormy night, refusing to be intimidated by people who had never once bothered to actually know her. Lady Beatrice, true to her word, welcomed Eleanor warmly into the family, quickly discovering that the young woman's practical wisdom and genuine warmth made her far better suited to the responsibilities of a duchess than any of the polished, calculating women Nathaniel had previously considered. Even Eleanor's parents, initially overwhelmed by the sudden shift in their daughter's fortunes, found themselves grateful beyond words, not simply for the financial security the match would bring, but for the obvious happiness written across their daughter's face whenever Nathaniel was near. Their wedding took place the following spring, in the same garden where Nathaniel had proposed. The roses Eleanor had tended herself blooming brilliantly around the small gathering of family and close friends. She wore a simple gown, nothing like the elaborate creations favored by London's fashionable brides, and Nathaniel told her as she walked toward him that she had never looked more beautiful than she did in that moment, radiant and entirely herself. During the celebration afterward, as guests mingled and laughed beneath strings of lantern light, Eleanor found herself standing beside Nathaniel near the very spot where she had first opened the door to him during that violent storm so many months before. "Do you remember what I looked like that first night?" she asked, smiling at the memory that had once embarrassed her so thoroughly. "I remember perfectly," Nathaniel said, pulling her close. "Hair a complete mess, nightgown soaked through, gripping a fireplace poker like you were prepared to use it on me." "I very nearly was," she admitted, laughing. "I have never been more grateful for a poorly timed storm in my entire life," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Because it brought me to a door where the most honest, unguarded, remarkable woman I have ever known was standing on the other side, entirely unimpressed by anything except whether I needed help. You fell in love with me looking an absolute mess, Alina said, shaking her head at the memory. I fell in love with you exactly as you were, Nathaniel corrected gently. Messy hair, worn nightgown and all. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people performing perfection, Alina. You were the first person who never bothered performing anything at all, and it turned out that was precisely what I had been searching for without ever knowing it. As the evening wore on and the last light faded from the garden sky, Alina found herself thinking that sometimes the most important moments in life arrived without any warning at all, disguised as inconvenient storms and broken carriages, asking nothing more than a willingness to open the door and see what stood on the other side.